Welcome back, AP. All right, so just want to go ahead and throw this out there. Before we even get started, I just want to tell y'all that I am so proud that we were able to cover so much content, tell that ridiculously long story, introduce two very brand new, very important characters. You might want to go back in your notes and highlight those names, right? Maximilien Robespierre and Jean-Paul Marat, right? You might want to just kind of like gloss over them and be like, okay, these guys are important. They go in line with all of our big guys that we've been talking about during the French Revolution, our Abbe Sieyès, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Jacques Necker, right? The Marquis de Lafayette, Marie Antoinette, their children, they all go and they rank up there with those figures, right? So Maximilien Robespierre, Jean-Paul Marat, very important, okay? So, and when we left off in class, we were talking about the Women's March. This is still a part of the liberal phase, right? We don't get into the radical phase until 1793, but the big thing about it is we are now still a part of this liberal phase, and the biggest effect of the radical event that was, or the intense event that was the march, the Women's March on Versailles, was the placing of the return of Louis and his family to Paris, right? The marching back to Paris with the Women's March, right? So going back to Paris with them was a very big liberal event that occurred, and they're going to be placed under house arrest, of course, at the Tuileries Palace, right? Now, interesting note to kind of go ahead and throw out there. Obviously, by just looking at this, we can tell something really important right now. Louis and his power are dwindling, right? Again, he is no longer the king of France, just like we all noticed in class, and you're like, wow, that actually is really important. He is no longer the king of France as of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He is now the king of the French, right? So the big thing about it is he is now kind of a moldable, malleable, mushable, new era kind of king, right? They don't want to get rid of their monarch quite yet, but they know they don't want him to have as much power as he used to. So the big thing going forward is the National Assembly is going to decide that if we're going to have a king that has little to no power, we have to figure out a system to create a new government where we have a legislative assembly or a legislative body that is actually picked in a very specific way and all this other stuff, because they do have a problem right now. You got a king under house arrest, and you got a legislative body ruling over France, known as the National Assembly, that was never really truly formally chosen by the French people, right? So the French people never really got together and they were like, oh, we definitely want this guy, we want this guy, we want this guy. The way the National Assembly was chosen is it's the leftovers of the Estates General who wanted a revolution, right? Remember when it was formed at the Tennis Court Oath? It was just members of the First, Third, and Second Estate that agreed that a revolution needed to happen, or they agreed that the ancient regime needed to be destroyed, right? They were not formally chosen. So they do have to figure something out. So what they are going to do from 1790 to 1791 is they're going to consolidate their power, right? They're going to get together and they're going to do a lot of different things, right? And I want you to make a very important little note of this, okay? Somewhere really quick, just kind of write a little star. They are going to write multiple different constitutions, all right? They are going to come up with a lot of new ideas over time, because they're going to be like, okay, we thought this was a good idea, but we're going to throw this one out. We're going to rewrite a new one. And we thought this was a good idea, and we're going to throw this one out because we're going to rewrite a new one. And you got to understand why that makes a lot of sense. It's because there's chaos in the streets, right? You've got people robbing, killing, the Great Fear, the night of August 4th, the Women's March, these events, the burning of the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille. You've got so much riotous things going on that you need to kind of be lenient with these people and be like, I mean, I understand that first constitution might not be the best one, right? So, but what the National Assembly is going to do is they're going to consolidate their power and try to make more proper steps to figuring out how they're going to make sure that everything is formally laid out the way it's supposed to, right? So the big thing, though, going forward is they are going to solve the immediate financial crisis, right? The National Assembly looks at French debt, looks at their financial crisis, looks at all the problems that Louis, for some reason, could not figure out, and they solved it pretty much with one event. All right, so I'm not kidding. They basically fixed the financial issues of the French people, or at least got them to a point where they weren't underwater or drowning anymore, with an event that you need to star right here, known as the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, right? And the Civil Constitution of the Clergy is going to create a system where the Catholic Church no longer owns the French lands and the French churches in France. What it does is it nationalizes the Catholic Church in France, right? Now, some of y'all are probably immediately like, well, you can't really do that because it's the Catholic Church. and it's an organization that relates back to the Vatican and Italy, and it's ran by the Pope. So you can't really have the French people nationalize Catholicism. It doesn't really work that way. You're not wrong, but they're going to do it anyway, right? So what they end up doing is they create a system where they actually tell every priest, bishop, and cardinal in France, you no longer own squat, all right? You don't own anything. You don't own the land that the churches sit on. You do not own papal lands anymore. You don't own the monasteries anymore. Those belong to the French people now, right? And what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to give all of your tithe money and all of the leftover money you have to the French government, right? So think about this for a hot second. In one event, and I believe it was June of 1790, they literally solved the immediate financial crisis by stripping from the church, the Catholic Church of France, their tithe, their lands, their monasteries, and then redistribute that land back to the people of France. Now, then what they're going to do is they're going to force every priest to take an oath, right? That they will be loyal to France before they are loyal to the Catholic Church, okay? Now, this is going to be a big event that kind of splits the continent of Europe wide open, okay? Mainly just due to the fact that some people in Europe are going to agree with this move because they've been Protestant since the Reformation, and some people are going to be very, very offended by it because they're still devoutly Catholic. But there's a myriad of other issues why these other countries didn't attack and stuff, but we'll talk about that later on. So what they end up doing is they force the priests to take an oath of allegiance, right? And in this oath of allegiance, they had to swear that they will not betray the people of France and that they will do their best interests at heart before listening to the Pope that's all the way out in Italy, right? And this swearing of loyalty split the church population in France in half, right? Not the people, but the priests themselves, right? So the priests that agreed to take this oath under punishment of prison time, possible execution. So the National Assembly told them, it's like, if you do not take this oath, you will go to jail, right? Like you will go to jail and you will also possibly be executed, right? So the priests that agreed to take the oath were called swearing priests. And I don't mean swearing priests like they're going around dropping F-bombs left and right. I mean swearing priests as in they just agreed to this oath, right? And then you have what's known as refractory priests, right? And refractory priests were the ones who refused to take the oath. They were then immediately put in jail, right? So, but this is still a really big moment in French history because they solved that financial crisis by stripping all that land, stripping all that wealth, and forcing the priests to actually agree to serve France rather than the Catholic faith. Or not the Catholic faith, rather than the Catholic hierarchy, the Pope, the cardinals, and everything back in Italy and in the Vatican. Now, another big thing that the National Assembly is going to do is that they are going to formally abolish the nobility, which pretty much already happened in August the 4th, but they're going to formally do this with a new document and a new constitution that apparently abolishes the nobility. They rewrite this new constitution, and they also create inside of it a constitutional monarchy. They limit the power of the kings, and they basically create a constitutional system that is mirrored in England, right? They create a new system where he must follow the rules of the people. He has literally only inherited his rights from the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He is now more of a person and less of a divine right ruler, right? So the big other thing, though, is all lawmaking is now going to reside within the National Assembly, right? Any legislative body that exists in France, they are the ones that now have lawmaking power. The king doesn't have squat, all right? So he can't do anything about that. And in the biggest part about it, they also increase the rights of women. Let's go. That's right. They allow women to finally divorce their husbands if they choose to. They allow women to have property rights. They also allow women to have control and possession and custody rights of their children. And they allow women to inherit the property of their husbands should something happen to them or should they die, right? Because before the revolution occurred, the rights of women were very stifled, right? Women did not have the ability to divorce their husbands because it was a Catholic country. They did not have the ability to inherit property from their deceased husbands. That went to the nearest relatives of the husband instead. They also did not have any real custody rights over their children, right? This is insane. And so lawmakers and in the National Assembly are going to give these rights to women. Yes, women get a win. And you know why they owe that to them? I don't know. The March on Versailles. Sounds like they probably owed it to them anyway. And there are going to be a lot of big figures that actually really, really go out there and really, really try to advocate for the rights of women. Now, it's not a perfect system, but it did work. And you got people like the Marquis de Concord de Sèvres, all right? I've misspelled his name on this Prezi. You don't really need to write him down, but he's important. The big thing about him is he actually advocated not only for the rights of women and the equality of women, but he also even advocated for the rights of all races. And he said slavery should be abolished in France altogether, right? Now, that was a big step for a lot of the French people, and they were getting closer and closer to that moment. And you'll see how that kind of leaks into one of their colonies here in about 2 seconds. But that's a big movement, and his impetus and his writings and his speeches was a big reason why women actually earned a massive new right and actually more equal rights under the law, right? Then you've got Olympia de Gaulle, which a lot of y'all are going to like a lot, and you can go ahead and write her name down. But Olympia de Gaulle is actually going to be even more seditious, right? And Olympia de Gaulle actually thought that the National Assembly didn't give enough rights to women specifically, right? They were like, not only do we deserve the right to divorce our husbands and do all these things, but we deserve rights to hold our own jobs, do our own thing, get educated, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And she went as far to write a document later on in the revolution known as the Declaration of the Rights of Women, right? So, and a lot of you are like, ooh, yeah, get on with your bad self, girl. Let's go, get after it. Unfortunately, she's going to be executed a few years later by guillotine. Ooh. So, but, it's still, she's a very major important figure to kind of show the increasing rights of women under the French Revolutionary Party. Look at Olympia de Gaulle. Olympia de Gaulle, girl. Now, anyway, really quick. So, that was the dorkiest thing I've ever done. Now, actually, that's probably not true. Now, the other big thing about it is revolutionary fervor and intensity is also spreading to the French colony. All right? Colonies. Now, the biggest one, though, is their colony known as Saint-Domingue. Now, I know one of you uber nerds right now, like Kimberly Adams, is just going like, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry. I know everything about this class, and I know for a fact that after the French and Indian War and after the 7 Years' War, France lost, all of their colonies. They did. You're right, Kimberly. But they kept one, right? They kept one, which is the big one they wanted, right? And as we know, that was Haiti, right? Now, Haiti, at the time, is not called Haiti. It's still called Saint-Domingue, right? And they made a ridiculous amount of money off of it, okay? Now, the thing about it, though, is that colony is just as unstable as France, okay? The people in Haiti start to learn of the revolution going on in the colony, right? And there have been massive numbers of slave revolts because 90% of the population that lives in Haiti is African descendants, former or current slaves, right? And there were massive revolts, which set up a very, very weird socially divided situation, right? You had wealthy whites known as Grand Blancs, right? You had poor whites known as Petit Blancs. You had free people of color, and you had slaves, but then you had everyone else. But in those four classes, they were constantly at odds with each other, right? The slaves resented the free people of color because some of those free people of color owned slaves, right? They also resented the poor whites, but the poor whites resented the free people of color, and the wealthy whites resented everybody else. So it was very unstable. And so this revolution kicks everything into high gear, and it starts massive revolts going on in Haiti, right? As you can see right here, this comes later on in the late 1790s, that actually this whole thing occurs, when Haiti has an armed, militarized, this is around 1797 or 1796, so this is actually more towards the Directory phase, when they actually have a full militaristic style revolt. And as you can see, here is a former slave of Haiti holding the head of a French soldier in his hand. But the big thing about it is there were these things called the Code Noir, which actually is the thing that the black codes that set up all this stuff and kind of really, really enforced slavery in Haiti or in Saint-Domingue in 1685. All that's beginning to break down, and it's starting to vanish by the 1780s. So the revolution was really all the spark that lights the flame that actually continues these things going on in the colonies as well. So that's spread differently in Haiti, but it's still spread in the colony, and violence is even erupting now in their colonies. So from this slide, what we're trying to get at is that the revolution was not solely isolated in France, right? It's not even spreading to their most profitable colony that they still have, which is Saint-Domingue. Literally, it made so much money because 90% of Europe's sugar, if it was bought from somewhere, came from this one colony. And also 60% of its coffee came from this one colony. So France was making a considerable amount of money off this colony, but the problem is that there's violence erupting on it now because of the revolution happening in France, right? So very important thing that we understand that, okay? Now let's get radical, okay? Now, really, really fast, that doesn't mean that the radical phase is starting right now, okay? It's going to start very soon because the liberal ideas are falling all to pieces, right? As you can see, we've got violence erupting in our colonies. We've got women being executed because they want more rights than even the rights that they were being given, right? We've got things are kind of like these like constant band-aids of these constant fixings with these documents and everything. It's starting to show its face as not being actually able to work. So there was a common phrase that was actually said by Maximilien Robespierre, Jacques Necker, and several other leaders of the French Revolution. They said the revolution is over after the new constitution had been issued in 1792, right? The issue is it's not really over, all right? They don't know what lays on the horizon, but there's far more revolution to come, right? The revolution doesn't even really truly end until 1815, right? So, and we're only in the 1790s. So we've still got almost 20 years of revolution to go, right? But this is just kind of to show you that they thought that it was over, but it wasn't, right? So then also, this comes to the point as of the 1790s, when we get into 1792, 1793, 1794, where the foreign powers are starting to look at France as being like, okay, maybe they're not going to be able to crush this like we thought they were, right? And the thing that's starting to show its face is these new political isms, liberalism versus conservatism, are starting to kind of agree or disagree on the way everything's going, right? So, for example, Edmund Burke and Mary Wollstonecraft. These are two English citizens, right? Edmund Burke is a famous English historian, and he actually wrote one of the most famous histories on the fall of the Roman Empire, called The Fall of the Roman Empire, right? It's over 700 pages of very in-depth research and translations of Roman ideas and histories, but he's a notorious conservative, right? He actually believes that the king should be reinstalled. He believed that the French Revolution was a ravenous mob of poor ingrates that actually didn't take account of the things that they already got and blah, 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 blah. So Edmund Burke, politically, is a big tool. I like him as a historian, but politically, he's kind of a jerk. Now, so he actually spoke down about the revolution itself. While as Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a very, very important figure, who was a writer, a poet, and an English literature icon in her own right in England, she actually wrote love letters about the revolution. She discussed how much she was in love with the idea of the people standing up for their own rights and actually overthrowing their government and implanting new ideas, right? So these two ideas right here, these two figures kind of show you how other people throughout Europe are starting to get really, really feisty, and they're starting to get really, really upset about this revolutionary process because they believe that it is either justified or not justified, right? Now, then you're going to have some major events, okay? And the first one is known as the Flight to Varennes, okay? And that happens in June 1791. So in October of 1789, the Women's March happens. So the royal family has been under house arrest since October of 1789, okay? And it's now June 1791. And the royal family is under house arrest in the Tuileries, and they're sitting around and they're watching the consolidation of power by the National Assembly. They're hearing of the violence occurring in their colonies. They're hearing that other Europeans are starting to be like, man, this is so wrong, or this is so right, okay? So they're starting to hear all these things, and they're getting really freaked out. And Louis actually makes a decision because he's like, you know what? If we stay here, we're going to die. He really truly believes that if we remain in France, we will die, right? And he thinks to himself, he's like, we got to get out of here. We have to get out of here. We have to escape, and that is what occurs on the Flight to Varennes, is an attempted escape by the royal family. And where are they trying to get? To a place called Varennes, which is a town that has a large military fort that's still loyal to the king, okay? Now, if they can get to this town known as Varennes, which is about 19 to 20 miles outside of Paris, right? So it's a pretty big hike, okay? So if they can get there, they feel that they will be safe, and then that military unit will be able to smuggle them over the border into Austria, right? So their ultimate goal in this event is to get to Austria. And why do they want to get to Austria? They want to get to Austria because that is where Marie Antoinette's brother, King Leopold II, is currently ruling over the Austrian government, right? And that is the same Leopold II that we talked about that undid all the reforms of his brother, Joseph II, and the one that actually resurfed everybody. So he's kind of a jerk too. But it's one of Marie Antoinette's 15 brothers and sisters, okay? So the big thing about it at the flight to Varennes, they have to come up with a plan, okay? They got to come up with a plan. How are we going to get out of here? What are we going to do? I don't know what we're going to do. And it's a little story, and you don't have to write this whole thing down. Just kind of listen to it and enjoy it for a second. So what ends up occurring in the flight to Varennes, they come up with a plan, and they're like, okay, 1, we got to leave at night, okay? We have to leave at night. 2, we got to try and move as fast as we possibly can, all right? And 3, we got to be undetected, all right? Those are their basic parameters of their entire idea. And the king still has some people that are pretty loyal to him when it comes to his government and his ruling style and things like that. But the thing about it is he's really, really nervous, as he should be, because he does feel that something's going to go wrong. But here's the ultimate irony. Everything about this escape plan gets screwed up because of Louis XVI, because he ruins everything, right? So the original plan was for them to all get in disguises and to dress as if they were servants for Marie Antoinette's cousin, who was one of the royal family members of Russia, right? So the idea was she was going to come visit them from Russia to see them under house arrest, because the Marquis de Lafayette is still a human being, right? And like so is the Abbé Sieyès, and they know that they're under house arrest, and they had planned on keeping the king alive for the entire time, because they were like, we still want a king in France. We don't necessarily want to abolish the monarchy just yet. So they allowed their Russian cousin to come and actually visit them, right? And so the big thing about it was there was heavy guard, and there was always like someone watching, but the plan was that she would come with several servants, right? Male and female. And what would happen is those servants would stay behind, and the king and the queen would take their clothes, disguise themselves, hop in the carriage with her, and then leave and escape to Varennes, and they would get there, right? And so the plan was that they would leave at about midnight, right? While everybody's gone to sleep, and this is long before like gaslit street lamps were a big thing, and it was when it was dark in Paris, it was dark, all right? The idea would be they would sneak out around midnight, right? So they start getting ready, right? And that night they start getting ready, and this, of course, occurs, like I said, in June of 1791. They're getting all their things ready. They're packing all their bags. They're about to put their costumes on, and then out of nowhere, Louis starts getting stupid, right? So Louis, one of his servants come up to him, and they're like, sir, we have the carriage ready. It's the lighter carriage. It will be smaller, and it can actually be pulled by just 2 horses. So we'll be able to move you as quickly as possible. And then Louis tells his servant, you know what? I'd rather travel more comfortably. Do the grand carriage, right? And he tells them to switch the carriage to the royal carriage, which has to be drawn by not 2 horses, but 4 of them, making it slower and also making it louder, right? Which is like really dumb. And the servant's like, are you sure about this? And he's like, yeah, I'm sure. We're going to get away with it. Don't worry. So it sounds to me that Louis is getting a little bit arrogant, right? So Louis actually at this point then sits down at his desk and he begins to write something. Well, then out of nowhere, being the man that he is, the Marquis de Lafayette showed up in the middle of the night on a surprise inspection. He was like, oh, I'm just here to see, make sure everything's going okay. Are you okay? Is everybody okay? Is the wife happy? How are the kids, right? And Louis like, oh, hey, how are you? And he's trying to cover up the fact that they're about to escape, right? And he sits there and he talks to him for over an hour. So it puts them behind schedule, right? Because this is the big key thing that some of y'all probably aren't even thinking about yet. During June, you're getting close to the summer solstice, right? You're getting closest to some of the longest days of the year. So you've got to get from Paris to Varennes before the sun comes up, or else you'll be spotted, right? So you got to get there quick. So every hour you get delayed, that's an hour more time you're going to be in the light of the day, and someone will see you and you can possibly get caught, all right? So the big thing about it is the Marquis de Lafayette sits down with him and he actually starts talking to him. And they end up talking for over an hour. And Louis is like, okay, you got to go. I got to go to bed. And then he's like, so he shoos the Marquis out, and the Marquis leaves. And then Louis sits back down and keeps writing something, right? And he keeps writing. And he takes this letter, and he folds it up, and he seals it, and he places it on his pillow, right? So he sits it on his pillow, and he leaves it there. Louis just wrote a letter to the people as he's leaving. You couldn't have just left, man, and I haven't even gotten to what the letter says yet, okay? So they decide then that now's the time, okay? So it's about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning, and they only have a few hours to get 19 miles, all right? So they have to get a very, very long distance away. So they actually hop down, and they all they're like, okay, let's all go out one at a time so we don't look like ridiculous, right? And so Louis leaves, and they're like, okay, but they look at the family, and they're like, okay, fam, you're going to go down this hallway, you're going to go down the stairs, you're going to go left, you're going to go right, you're going to go out the back door, and you're going to turn right. left. Make sure you turn right. When you turn right, the carriage should be right down on the quarter, and we should all be safe, and we all should be sound, okay? And so he tells everybody the directions, and everybody follows him. Louis goes down first, and then one of the kids comes down, and then one of the other daughters comes down, and then the son comes down, and Marie is supposed to go last, all right? And Marie comes down the stairs, and she goes down the stairs, turns right, turns left, does her thing, then gets outside, turns the wrong direction. Turns left, can't find the carriage, and is wandering alleyways in Paris for over an hour while they try to find her. They finally find her, they get her in the carriage, and they start off towards Varennes, right? And then time progresses forward, right? Now, we're about like 4 a.m. now, getting close to the sun coming up. The Marquis comes back to actually go check on the royal family and things like that. And then a soldier comes up to him and they're like, sir, we found a letter on Louis's pillow. And in this letter, it said, I, King Louis, am going to return to Paris with an army of all of Europe, including the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians. And I'm going to destroy this revolution and reinstall my absolute power. So that letter was threatening to destroy the revolution, right? That's insane. That is absolutely wild. And then what ends up happening, the Marquis is like, sound the alarm. They gather up the National Guard and they start off out, and the Marquis is like, I know where they're going. If they're going to go anywhere, they're going to Varennes. That's where that one military fort is that actually is still loyal to him. They start off after him. Now remember, keep this in mind, they're being dragged along by 4 horses in a giant carriage, and they're going slower than a bunch of guys on singular horses, right? So they're catching up to them. And then also you have to stop every now and again to give the horses water and feed them. So they did that. The royals stopped at a small town between the 2 destinations, and instead of, hiding, being normal, sitting down, laying in the carriage and not getting out, they got out and talked to people in the village and gave them like silver-plated dishes and all this other stuff, which is like ridiculous. And then people were like, aren't you the king? And he was like, well, yeah, but I'll be back. Don't worry. Like, so being an absolute tool. So they were doing a terrible job of escaping, okay? And then they're almost there. They're right outside of Varennes. They're only about a mile away, not even. And it's the very, very early morning and the sun's beginning to come up. Who are some of the people that get up super early to actually go to their job? Postal workers, right? And so a postman is on his horse and he's riding next to the carriage, right? He's just like, and he's just riding next to the carriage. And instead of hiding or ducking down now that the sun's coming up, Louis is sitting straight up, looking out the windows, looking at everything. And he eventually looks over and he sees the postal worker, and the postal worker looks at him and he waves at him. And then when Louis waves back, and the postal worker looks at him and he's like, wait a second. I know this guy. And and he's in disguise. Remember, he's dressed as like a butler. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a coin. Dude, you're the king of the French people. Your face is all over their money. And he looks at a coin, looks at Louis, looks at the coin, he's like, holy crap. And he's like, storms off as fast as he can to get to the National Guard that are right over in the next village. And they actually show up, catch the royals, throw them into a barn, beat the daylights out of Louis, and rearrest them because he couldn't just stick to the original plan, right? And then after this moment, everyone's really, really sure at this point that the abolishment of the monarchy is probably going to happen. Louis is probably not going to outlive this revolution. And so a very important document follows the flight to Varennes, right? And it's known as the Declaration of Pillnitz, right? And the Declaration of Pillnitz is a document written and signed by the powers and the kings of Europe, including Frederick of Prussia, including Leopold of Austria, including very, very many of the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, and also several other leaders of other areas, including Russia, saying that if you hurt or touch Louis or kill him, we will invade your entire country. So the big thing about it is you're seeing that the Europeans are now becoming very, very aware of what's going on, and so the National Assembly makes their first move to getting rid of the monarch. And they liquidate themselves, and they decide we are going to replace the National Assembly with a new legislative body that will be called the Legislative Assembly, and it will be elected amongst the French leaders, right? So they decided to create a new Legislative Assembly per the new Constitution, and they start moving forward, all right? So we're going to stop right there. I hope y'all enjoy your weekend. I know it's a really long story and a lot of intense stuff, but look, right here, we are almost to the end of this unit already, but we'll talk about that stuff soon. I'll see y'all later. Y'all have a good one.